So today we're going to kind of analyze the Agarwal automobiles case study from Ivy Publishing and look at forecasting approaches, model selection, and other strategic considerations that they need to consider when building their business plan. So first we're going to look at kind of the Kenneth Kahn forecasting framework and talk about that. So given market volatility and fuel demand variability, I think that they should adopt a hybrid approach within the Agarwal automobiles, combining the statistical forecasting as well as like managerial judgment. The reason why is after doing the adaptive forecasting, the daily and monthly forecasting and everything, the numbers are kind of all over the place depending on which model you use. It's going to take a little bit of insight within the company as well as looking at the political landscape to determine what forecast model is best. So next, alternate frameworks. Stable demand firms such as utility, right, rely on quantitative models, while startups heavily rely on judgment within the company because of lack of historical data. The Agarwal automobiles, they have statistical data, but there's also a lot of outside influence on what could happen within the price of fuel, diesel, and everything. The EV market, based on the data that I got from the Excel sheet, seems to be a little bit more stable, but I think that's just because there's still a lot of like tax dividends and tax incentives for using those vehicles, so it kind of levels out the overall costs. Petrol and diesel, that's always been volatile depending on the political issues going on in the world. Take the issues with Iran right now in the Strait of Hormuz, that's impacting the cost of fuel drastically just in the last 3 weeks. So it's going to be kind of a combination of both the quantitative models using historical data and then just the judgment models based on the political environment that's currently happening. Next, time series models considered, right? So we use like the average, exponential smoothing, and trend analysis. All of them had their strengths and weaknesses. Moving average seemed to have a more level deviation within it, but also based on the historical data that we had provided, it was drastically off from historical data. Exponential smoothing seemed to have the most consistent forecast. It was still off from the historical data, but it wasn't off as by much, depending on what the exponential smoothing ratio was. So overall, looked at all, seems like a combination of them is going to be what's best for this particular company. Next, for petrol, exponential smoothing seemed to be the best. Looking at the data, it showed moderate variability and the benefits from weighted recent observations, right? But then again, looking at the issues we have with Strait of Hormuz and oil shipments coming out of the Middle East right now, like that's going to fluctuate greatly in the coming months. So it really depends on the political landscape as well. For diesel, I kind of went with a trend projection. So it shows a declining trend, making regression-based trend models more appropriate. But again, given the current political landscape, not factoring the historical data that we were provided, I think the exponential smoothing would be a little bit better in modern times, but in the time frame with the data that we had for this case study, I believe trend protection is going to be the best. And then next, the alternate fuel forecast, right? It is emergent volatile, so went with like a moving average. Smoothing kind of helps reduce the validity of this particular fuel. But like I said previously, I believe that like the tax incentives for alternate fuel, EV, solar, all of that kind of take away some of the validity to begin with. So, justification, right? We looked at the MAD, MSE, and MATE. We used those as standard forecasting metrics, and overall, it was all over the place depending on the average forecasting, whether you're using 5-day, 7-day, any of that. Like it changed the error metrics drastically. Same thing with the exponential smoothing, all of that. Everything was kind of all over the place. But we use those kind of justify the selections that I mentioned previously. And then, like I mentioned previously, like short-term decisions should be considered, like market shocks, policy changes, everything. So going back to what's going on with the Strait of Hormuz with Iran right now, like all of that is going to definitely play a factor in what model they should use moving forward in environments such as these, because you can't capture that within the historical data. Right? Next, right, so long-term factors that we kind of took into consideration and what they should take into consideration are EV adoption, environmental regulations, and infrastructure. Right, so long-term strategy has to include all of this and not just focus on the historical trends, because everything changes and updates as we move through the current political climate, and those items, right, regulations, infrastructure, the adoption of electric vehicles is all going to kind of play a role in how everything plays out for this company. And then talking about when we should like override models and just kind of go with what the managerial judgment is just in high uncertainty scenarios. I'm going to go back to the Iran scenario with Strait of Hormuz right now. This is a high uncertainty scenario. We don't know exactly what's going to happen. We don't know how long it's going to go on. So the judgment of the managerial staff within the company is probably going to take precedence over the historical data that they have collected. They may be able to look back into different eras in time where a similar situation within that strait happened and use that to kind of help guide their decisions. But at the end of the day, it's going to be their judgment that's going to kind of take precedence over the different models that we talked about. So, in conclusion, I think that the Agarwal automobiles should integrate quantitative models with strategic insight to ensure that they're making informed decisions. Hybrid forecasting for them is kind of essential to make sure that they have the best future